Hello and welcome to the Hexagon. I'm Ellen Wiles, and in each episode of this series I invite a guest to tell me about their 5 top arts and culture tips for life under lockdown and beyond, and I offer a 6th tip myself. I'm delighted to welcome my guest for today, who is my lovely friend and a novelist, Rowan Hisayo Buchanan. We have an extra special 2-part episode today because Rowan is going to recommend not only 5 arts and culture tips with an extra tasty addition thrown in, but she's going to offer up her 5 top tips for starting a creative project under lockdown. So I hope you'll listen through to all of it. It's going to be great. Rowan Hisayo Buchanan is the author of 2 wonderful novels, Harmless Like You, a New York Times editor's pick, and Starling Days, her latest, which came out last year and was shortlisted for a Costa Novel Award. She is the winner of the Authors Club First Novel Award and a Betty Trask Award, among others. And her short work has appeared in several places, including Granta, The White Review, and The Atlantic. She is also the editor of Go Home, which is an anthology of Asian diasporic writers. So, Rowan, could you start off by telling me a bit about how lockdown has been for you? Have you managed to find much time for arts and culture?
Well, it's been especially strange because it began when I was supposed to go on tour for Starling Days in America because I had just come out there, and obviously that did not happen. But that said, I think I've been very lucky, although I have had family members that I've been worried about at various points. They all seem to be okay right now, which, I feel hugely fortunate about. And so I think it's just been probably the same as it has been for many of you out there, the sort of ongoing hum of anxiety and trying to be productive despite that.
Absolutely, yeah, sounds very familiar. And how about some highlights of your working life over this past year? I guess it's within the last year that Starling Days came out, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I guess, yes, my second novel, Starling Days, came out, and that was exciting. And I got to be interviewed in this magazine called the Paris Review that I really have loved for many years. And sort of when I was just starting out being a writer, I thought, oh, that's where the real writers are. And that felt very special to me.
Yeah, it certainly is. That's a great interview. I recommend you all dip into that. I'll add a link to this episode. So it's time for your first arts and culture tip for today. What's it going to be and why are you recommending it?
Okay, so the first thing, or in fact person, that I'm going to recommend is a photographer called Ricko Kawauchi, and she primarily works in photo books, but you can view a lot of her images on her website, rikkokawauchi.com, which I'm sure will be linked.
It will be linked.
And what I love about her work, and I've loved for many years, is that she is tremendously sensitive to light and to color, and her images have this delicacy and this beauty. And some of them are about traditionally beautiful subject matter, a rose, some watermelon on a plate, eyelashes, a tiny frog. But others are very dark, and she's unflinching about that. It might be something sort of in between, like the aging a family, but it might be a body covered in flies, it might be chicken heads, but she applies the same sensitivity and sense of beauty to all of her work, and I think that is very admirable to me. Additionally, because I'm a novelist, I find the use of the photo book as the main medium very interesting, because she says she thinks in terms of series of images instead of as an image, but she's not a photojournalist. So she's working with association and atmosphere to create a narrative. And I know, that moves me.
That sounds wonderful. And yeah, the way you describe the aesthetic and the sense of experiencing her work reminds me very much of my sense of reading your work. So nice synergies there. How about your second tip for today?
Okay. My second tip is also a Japanese creative, although this time a short story writer. I have the book here. It's called Where the Wild Ladies Are, and it's by Matsuda Aoko. And so I've just started reading this recently, partially because I admire the translator, Polly Barton, and I've been loving it. It's wonderful. So all of the stories are sort of bouncing off traditional Japanese monster tales or ghost tales, but they're not straight retellings. So for example, there'll be a story about, well, a story based on a tale about a ghost who comes to haunt her ex-lover after she's been drowned. And in this version, the ghost ends up falling in love with a new lady she never knew in life, who she meets many, many years later. And the two women fall in love, and every day the ghost comes and has to have the mud washed off her by her lover. And her lover's like just very pleased about having met this ghost, and the ghost is her true love. Or there's another ghost story where, and this isn't giving too much away, don't worry, there's so much in here. There is a story about a woman who goes to haunt her husband with his new wife, and is very jealous in the original. And in this version, she visits her husband, she's like, I don't really care, and enjoys being like a skinhead ghost in the afterlife. And one last one to tell you, because there's so much. There's a story about a woman who is told she can bring anyone back from the dead, anyone or her parents, not to life, but to meet, and she chooses her cat. So yeah, very much recommend. Very fun, very joyful, and yet I guess also a bit dark. Clearly this is my jam.
sounds brilliant. And yeah, there's so much, often in Japanese fiction I've read, there's so much sort of brilliant bizarreness and strangeness, and that sounds like a great example of that. In fact, I haven't read any Japanese fiction for ages, so I must delve into that. Thank you for that tip. So how about your third tip for today?
Okay, so one of the things that I really actually struggled with before lockdown to get into is podcasts. I never felt like I had time or could rejig things to make it space to want to be listening to them. But perhaps because I'm no longer going to talks or to museums, I found myself actually really getting into podcasts. And so one of them is a podcast called 99% Invisible that covers a huge range of topics: architecture, art, design, history. And what I love about it is that they're both very specific. So I listened to an episode recently about concrete called The Smell of Concrete After Rain, which, is not something you think as a non-architect you'd want to get into, but they connect it to wider social issues, to bigger ideas about society and the individual and art and design. And I find that both surprising and inspiring.
Great. Yeah, I love that podcast too. And I especially love Roman Mars's voice, the presenter. He's got such a dulcet tone to his voice. Great, thank you. And how about your fourth tip for today?
I'm going to actually tell them to you in a slightly different order than I have told Ellen I was going to say them, which is because I thought I would put the two podcasts together. Yeah, the other one is a podcast called Creative Pep Talk that is basically what it says on the can. It's a series of creative pep talks, and some of them are about sort of your own approach to your work and sort of your own psychology, and some of it is sort of about business or how to build your platform. And this was actually recommended to me by an illustrator friend of mine, Emma Kosh. I've only just started getting into it, so I have not actually used any of their tips, but they're very encouraging. So if you need some encouragement, I recommend them.
Oh, that sounds exactly like what many people feel that I've spoken to feel they need right now in these current circumstances. So I will definitely be checking that out. Thank you. And for the next one.
Okay, so I was trying to think of something short because I've recommended these vast topics and whole books. And there's an article I read fairly recently interview with the writer and photographer Teju Cole. You may know him from his novella Open City, which was very, very well received. And so he has a new book out, which is a photography book called Fernwe. And I may not be pronouncing that correct, I'm very sorry. But it means far woe or far longing. And this is a book of photographs he's done about Switzerland and his sort of ambivalence about what it means to be a colonial subject in different places, and also trying to create new images of the Alps, a very imaged place. And I just found it a very thought-provoking interview, and I now also want to get the photography book, but I do not have it yet. I think I particularly was intrigued because I've been reading another book, I'm sticking this in, called Lovers Discourse by Xiaolu Guo. And she also is very interested in literally the same word, Fernwe, and this concept of longing for a place that you're not in. And she compares it to wanderlust, and how wanderlust is a sort of more jolly word in some ways. It sort of implies desire, whereas far woe is almost a pain that is driving you. And she thinks about the difference between the two. So when I stumbled across Teju Cole's interview, I thought, oh, there's something on everyone's mind at the moment.
Yeah, it sounds very timely indeed as well. Thank you. And I think we have a little bonus. I mean, we all need fuel for our arts and culture consumption. So what's your suggestion, Katie?
This is truly, I don't think this counts purely as a creative tip, but recently, while I've been consuming all this highbrow arts and culture, I have needed to eat, because eating is very nice. And I stumbled across this recipe on the Minimalist Baker for roasted chickpeas. You basically put them in olive oil and salt, and you leave them in the oven for 20 minutes, and then you have this delicious snack that you can trick yourself is healthy, because chickpeas are full of protein and other nutrients, but also feels a bit just like eating popcorn. So
amazing, and probably much healthier than all the cake I've been eating lately. So these like chickpeas that are pre-cooked and soaked, or are they like from dry chickpeas? Does that work?
You can use pre-soaked ones, or you can use tinned ones, and you just dry them on a tea towel so that they'll crisp up nicely, and then you toss them in olive oil and salt, and then you put them in the oven. I'm not going to tell you the temperature because I do not recommend, do not remember it off by heart. But, and then she says afterwards you can add other seasonings like paprika and garlic powder, and yeah, anyway.
Sounds great. I've been doing a similar thing with kale lately that works really nicely. So chickpea sounds like a good variation. Excellent. So yeah, now for my sixth tip, or seventh if we count the bonus tip of this episode. So Rowan and I are clearly on a beam, because I was going to recommend a linked podcast, which is Articles of Interest. So it's a spin-off from Radiolab, and it's a 12-part series about clothing, and it's written and performed by Avery Trufelman. And I really like how she uses the word perform to describe what she does, because podcasts are a form of performance, and that seems to be forgotten in some podcasts I listen to that can drift into these long unedited chats, which can be very pleasurable, but this one is really adeptly crafted and delivered, and each episode focuses in on a particular item of clothing, like jeans or wedding dresses or Hawaiian shirts, or style like punk, not a fashion, which is a very different thing, as discussed at one point. And Trufelman tells this fascinating story, punctuated by interviews about why this item or style evolved in the way it has, and how it's become so iconic or central to contemporary culture. So yeah, it's such a great listen. It's already shone a light on the backstories of many of these clothing items that I've taken for granted, like jeans, or worn and felt comfortable about, like wedding dresses with their virginal implications. And I've listened to all 12 episodes now, and I hope they make some more. So I would recommend that. So now we have our part 2 of this extra special episode, where Rowan has come up with some 5 creative tips for a person who might be thinking about starting a creative project. So I think she's crafted these tips from the perspective of a writer, but similar principles should apply to any of you with artistic inclinations, or who just feel like doing something new and creative. So I'd love to hear about them. Could you take us through them?
Okay, so kicking my desk, not recommended. So I was sort of thinking about what tips would be useful for someone who maybe has been creative at some point in their life, or who loved doing it at school, but who has decided now in lockdown they want to do something, but maybe that's a bit tricky, or they decided at the beginning of lockdown, but now we're coming to the end and they're going, oh, I thought I would have written a novel by now, or, you know, made this huge art piece, and I have a few sketches. What do I do? And so these are a bit about creating in lockdown, but they're sort of just generally the advice that I've given myself and my students, because I teach, that have seemed to help them. So number 1, and this is going to seem pretty obvious, is stay in touch with why you want to make something. Like, what is it about this medium that has drawn you to it? So are there particular books or even films or artistic movements that brought you to loving this? And go back revisit them and think about not just like why they were good to culture, but why they were good to you specifically, what it was that drew you to them, that moved you, and think about how you can incorporate that in your work. That doesn't mean that you're making a pastiche. It just means that you're finding the kernel of your connection. And I think when you think about how much you love that, it's easier to feel positive and excited about your own work. So that's number one.
Wonderful tip. Yeah, I guess a lot of people get anxious about, reading at things at the same time as they're writing, or, being derivative. But then, we're all creatures of so many influences and inspirations. So I totally agree. Great idea to connect with those.
Yeah. And especially obviously if you're mixing influences, if you're inspired by 20 different things from 20 different time periods, then you're not going to end up being just like a carbon copy.
Exactly.
But second, and this is sort of connected to the first, but it's asking yourself what makes you feel deeply. So something I was thinking about is in fiction writing, there are lots of plotting techniques that are very useful. Fairy text pyramid, there's a sort of spirally one. Vonnegut has some different plot diagrams. They're all worth looking up, but they can be a bit distracting because you end up thinking, oh, this is going to make something good. And then I just sort of need to like plug in sort of main character, job, I don't know, lawyer, and it feels formulaic, and then you lose your connection to the work. So I think one of the things that's worth sitting with is what makes you feel deeply. That doesn't mean that your work has to be autobiographical, but if there are topics that you get really passionate about, if someone brings them up and you're like, no, what the thing no one understands is X. The minute you've got to the thing no one understands is X, you have something to make art about because you want to communicate something that you feel deeply. And I think that comes through to the reader as well.
Absolutely, that sense of emotional connection. Completely agree. It's a great tip. And how about your third?
My third is think about changing formats of your work. That sounds pretty vague, so I'll try to explain. I have writer friends who write purely by hand in notebooks for their first drafts and then type it up. I have a writer friend who typewrites her first drafts and then types it up, and she finds switching from one to the other makes her think about rewriting, makes her think about editing. But I also know someone who does that using her app for her like notes on her phone. So, it doesn't have to be fancy and Hemingway-esque. It can be that you're typing on your iPhone in bed and then you're transferring it to the big document, and that allows you to see it differently or see it new. For me, sometimes I write by hand, sometimes I don't, but I pretty much always print out my first draft so that I can see it on paper as well as on the screen. And that means I spot things that I wouldn't have spotted otherwise, moments that were clunky or that I just skimmed over,
Yeah, so interesting how that works. I experience exactly the same though. You always do come up with things when you read it on paper that you just don't notice on screen. I don't really understand quite why that is, but
I don't think it's just you, like your brain remembers seeing things in a particular place and it's like, oh, I know what that is, moving on. Yeah. And for those of you, because I know I have some students who don't have printers, they're just like, I don't have that, I can't do that. That's fine. A really, really simple thing is just to change the font. Yeah. I have a writer friend who's really harsh with her stuff. She puts it all in Comic Sans because she hates Comic Sans, and she cuts rigorously. But it can just be switching from Arial to Times New Roman, and sort of things end up in different places on the page and you notice them differently.
That's a really great idea. Alienate yourself as much as possible from the font. If you can get through that, it must be working.
The first two tips were like, love, enjoy. And then this third tip is like, be harsh. But you need a balance.
Absolutely. Oh, thanks for that. How about number 4?
So number 4 is if you're really just starting out. So I guess maybe I should have gone before 3, but if you're starting out, think about embracing constraint, because there are so many topics and so many forms and so many ways of doing things that you can end up feeling sort of like, what do I do? And then because you feel overwhelmed, you actually just go back to things that feel safe, either because you've done them 1,000 times before or you've seen them done by other people 1,000 times before. Mm-hmm. And that's not wonderful. So you can give yourselves assignments the way like your teacher might have, or a commissioning editor might. So I recently had to write a short story based on a video, like an artist's video. And it's one of my favorite things that I've written in like a really long time, because I was forced to think differently and find new images and approach the subject differently. So you can do that to yourself. You can, I think the Met Online archive is full of free to look at Creative Commons artworks. You can also use like a piece of music. So, maybe there's a David Bowie song you want to write based on, you want to capture that atmosphere and feeling. It can also be that you are totally free with your subject matter, but you want to be specific with your form. So if you've never written a sonnet, say, I'm going to write a sonnet. If you've never written a story under 500 words, or short under 500 words, or use loads of flashbacks or use no flashbacks, and see if you like it, experiment. And if it doesn't work, that's fine. Try something else. You'll have grown your artistic vocabulary.
Absolutely. Such a good tip. And it can also just be really fun to set yourself these little challenges, take off the pressure from doing the big project that you have in your mind. Great. And how about your fifth tip?
And my fifth one is even more simple. I am a writer, I know words. Is the simplest tip of all, which is just set realistic goals. If you say to yourself, I'm going to write 10,000 words a day, you're probably not going to succeed. I know some people can do it, but most people can't. And then when you don't succeed, you're left with the feeling of, oh, I failed and it's not worth trying again. Whereas if you set yourself an amount that you can do, you'll be left with a feeling of success and a desire to go back to it and to end up. And if you end up exceeding your goal, great, wonderful. No one has to stop you, but you succeeded at the moment you hit that much more manageable word count, whether that's 500 words or 2 pages. That will depend on who you are, on what, do you have childcare, do you have another job, what's going on. But just think about what that you could actually do every day. And it may not be a number of words, it may be write for half an hour. And this also goes to what happens in editing. So I find that I often get very intimidated, not in my first draft, which I find really fun. I'm just like, ooh, I can go anywhere, I can do anything, I'm a genius, I'm so brilliant. And then I write it down and I look back on it and I go, what was I thinking? Oh no, how am I ever going to make this good?
You're familiar.
And I think it's quite useful to break down editing in the same way. So either to say, oh, I'm only going to do a certain number of words, or to say, I'm only going to look at one thing. So I'm going to read this. I'm really thinking about making the dialogue work. I'm going to read this and really thinking about making the sentence lengths change and feel exciting. And because you're only focusing on one thing, A, you're more likely to notice it, but B, you don't have to stress about making it perfect immediately, because you can always go back and edit again. So
absolutely, yeah, achievable targets. It's very wise and practical psychological advice. That's a good final tip. Oh, thank you so much, Rowan. What a rich set of recommendations, and a double set too. So thank you doubly for that. And thank you all for watching. I hope some of these arts and culture tips and creative recommendations will inspire you wherever you are and however locked down you are right now. There will be more episodes coming soon, so I hope to see you next time. Bye for now.
Thank you for having me.